to the Norman yoke. Resistance was not yet over.
And from this struggle came leaders whose exploits are still remembered today. Hereward the Wake, lionised by the Victorians as an Anglo-Saxon hero, was an English landowner who ran a guerrilla campaign against the Normans in the fenlands of East Anglia. It took William 2 years to put down this rebellion, and he never caught Hereward. Thus a legend was born. In 1075, William was faced with yet another revolt, as a formidable coalition of Danes and Anglo-Saxon and disaffected Norman nobles plotted to overthrow the king. Among the conspirators was a trusted Anglo-Saxon earl, Waltheof of Bamborough. Waltheof had been one of the very few Saxon nobles who tried to work with William. William was so incensed at his betrayal that Waltheof became the only Anglo-Saxon nobleman to be executed by the Normans. William had him beheaded for treason outside the walls of Winchester Castle.
Waltheof became an instant folk hero. He was even revered unofficially as a saint. For Waltheof was a highly symbolic figure. With his death, the last of the great Anglo-Saxon earls had gone. But from William's point of view, his execution had done its work. After 1075, there was no further serious Anglo-Saxon resistance in England.
William could now turn his attention to governing the country rather than to subduing it. The Domesday Book tells us much about the scale of his ambitions. Using the sophisticated system of local government created by the Anglo-Saxons, William was able to carry out the first ever audit of land ownership in England, right down to the last cow and pig. Here was an English king whose aim was not simply to list, but to exploit the entire wealth of his nation. As a devout Christian, William was well aware of the power of the church over a population of simple believers, so he made sure that the church was run by Normans for Normans, and he ordered a huge programme of church building, including spectacular new cathedrals.
This is Ely, one of the most splendid of the Norman cathedrals. We think of it as a noble monument to God and the Christian faith. But there's much more to it than that. For Ely, then an island in the middle of the marshy fens, was one of the last centres of resistance to the Normans under Hereward the Wake. But within 10 years of Hereward's final defeat and disappearance into legend, there was a Norman abbot in Ely, and the building of this vast cathedral had begun, whose massive walls seem to crush out even the memory of revolt. So Norman cathedrals are like Norman castles, at once centres of Norman administration, advertisements for a new Norman way of life, and monuments to the permanence of Norman power. And above all, they were visible proof that God was on King William's side.
Of course, control of the church meant control of its vast wealth, and the fact that England was so rich had always been a factor in William's decision to invade. But what had attracted the Normans also drew other eyes. In 1085, William learned that the Danes and their allies were once again scheming invasion. So, next year, he brought over a great force of French mercenaries. But he also had to take political steps to head off trouble at home.
He summoned a meeting of the Great Council here to Old Sarum, the original site of the city of Salisbury. Every substantial landowner in the kingdom, William's own French barons, was required to attend and to swear an oath of allegiance to King William. No Anglo-Saxon king had ever needed to do such a thing. And the fight that William had showed that though he was a strong king, he had created a form of kingship that was inherently weak and depended to a dangerous extent on his own force of character. Nevertheless, the Oath of Salisbury worked. The planned invasion was called off, and William's regime was secured once more.
Less than a year later, William was dead, fatally injured in a riding accident. He may have been born a chancer, but he died a king. And as a king, he'd preserved the unity of England and the strength of the English monarchy, but at a terrible cost to his people and finally to his own conscience.
William was buried here at Caen Abbey in Normandy. For though becoming King of England was William's greatest achievement, he remained a Norman to the last, and he's the first King of England to be buried abroad. There was a final macabre postscript to William's life. In his later years, he'd become very fat, but his sarcophagus had been made too small, so that when the body was lowered into the sarcophagus, some force was necessary to fit it in. The result was described by the monk Orderic. William's swollen bowels burst, and an intolerable stench assailed the nostrils of the bystanders. Despite the clouds of fragrant incense, the funeral service had to be rushed to a conclusion.
For all his achievements, William's violent rule also left a stench in the nostrils of his people. What kind of legacy was this for his successor? And who would his successor be? For the Normans had no strict rules of royal inheritance. Instead, it was left to the dying king to make his wishes known. Normandy, William decided, should go to his eldest son, and England to his second-born. So, at the age of 29, William Rufus became the second Norman king of England.
Like his father, the Conqueror, William Rufus was a skilled soldier and a natural leader of men. He was strong-willed and determined to enforce his authority on the whole country. And he was, if anything, even more avaricious. He'd need to be, because in everything he did, his ambitions were on the grandest scale. Hence the fact that he built this, the Great Hall at Westminster. It's as big as a cathedral, and when it was built, it was the largest secular space in Europe north of the Alps. It was the setting for feasts and entertainments, and above all, for the crown wearings, which took place in Westminster every Whitsuntide. The king sat here, in the middle of the dais, crowned, robed, and enthroned, whilst the choir sang his praises in Latin, hailing him like a Roman emperor and wishing him vita et victoria, long life and victory. King William Rufus was always looking for new ways to extract money from England. And when he couldn't get it from the Norman barons or the Anglo-Saxon townsfolk, he wrung it from the church instead. He taxed the monasteries hard, and when bishops or archbishops died, he often refused to appoint a successor, keeping instead the revenues for himself. But William didn't only plunder the church. He was actively irreligious. He never married or fathered children. Instead, he had male favorites and was almost certainly homosexual. This unchristian life, in turn, led churchmen to loathe him. All this meant that William Rufus was a very different kind of ruler from his famously pious Norman ancestors. And he was even more remote from the Anglo-Saxon tradition of Christian monarchy, of Alfred the Great and Edward the Confessor.
England, it seemed, had exchanged the iron rule of the conqueror for the dangerous whims of a capricious and degenerate tyrant. William the Conqueror had been the most resolute of men, and his son, William Rufus, inherited his father's steely resolve. But too often it expressed itself merely as a whim of iron. Take the Forest Law. The Conqueror had ridden roughshod over English custom by inventing this law which gave him hunting rights over huge areas of countryside. William Rufus took over this arbitrary law and made it even harsher.
This is the New Forest, or rather, it's a tiny portion of the vast forest that once covered most of the county of Hampshire. To make it, William the Conqueror expelled over 500 families and seized 90,000 acres, and William Rufus added 20,000 more. And the New Forest was only one of many. At their maximum extent, towards the end of the 13th century, the forests covered 1/3 of the area of England, all of which was subject to the special oppressive system of law known as forest law.
William Rufus increased the penalties for breaking forest law to barbarous levels. Killing a deer was punishable by death. If you were caught shooting at one, your hands were cut off, and the punishment for simply disturbing a deer was blinding.
The laws were hated, partly because they were savage and punished poaching with mutilation, but above all because they were perceived as arbitrary and as being the product merely of the king's will and only serving his pleasure. In other words, they were un-English, and they were the most vivid reminder of the fact that England was a conquered country with an alien ruler with alien values. If the Normans were serious about trying to win English hearts and minds, as they sometimes claimed to be, then the forest laws were the wrong way to go about it.
After only 13 years, Rufus's end was ironic, for the hunter became the hunted. In the August of 1100, he was out hunting in the New Forest with a party that included his younger brother, Henry. One of the huntsmen fired an arrow that hit William in the chest. He died on the spot. No one knows whether it was an accident or murder. Henry and the other nobles fled, and it was left to the king's servants to bundle his body unceremoniously out of the forest.
William Rufus always got a bad press from contemporary writers, especially after he was safely dead. And the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, for instance, delivered the damning verdict. He was hateful to almost all his people and odious to God. But its authors would say that, wouldn't they? Because they were monks who detested his irreligion, his homosexuality, and his plundering of the wealth of the church. In fact, William Rufus was a highly competent king who maintained the unity and the stability of the kingdom that he'd inherited from his father. But he added nothing more, with the result that even after 3 decades of Norman rule, the English felt no ownership in their king and had no investment in him.
But this would begin to change. Within hours of Rufus's death, his brother Henry rushed to Winchester, seized the royal crown from the treasury, and rode off with it to London. There's no proof that Henry was implicated in his brother's death, but he certainly wasted no time in mourning him before declaring himself the next king of England. Henry's claim to the crown